Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Tristan Claridge, and it's a pleasure to be here with you as part of this ongoing webinar series. Since 2020, these sessions have been a place where ideas meet practice, where researchers, practitioners, and curious thinkers gather to explore what social capital means, why it matters, and how we can put it to work in the world. At the International Social Capital Association, we're committed to growing understanding and action around social capital. And we do that through conversations like this one, by learning together, by challenging assumptions and building the very relationships that we're here to talk about. If you find value in these conversations and want to stay connected, we'd love to welcome you to our community. We're honoured to be joined today by Dr. Aaron Nichols and Bridget Tehan for a presentation about the monetary value of social capital in post-disaster contexts, evidence from Australia. Aaron is a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics in Deakin Business School. He is a behavioural and experimental economist interested in how to measure and define unobservables within the revealed preference paradigm, and specifically in how rules of the market and the rules of the family interact. And we're also joined by Bridget, who is a senior advisor at the Australian Red Cross. She has more than 15 years' experience in emergency management and disaster resilience policy and practice, and has significant expertise in community resilience, including its strengths, needs, and priorities of people who may be vulnerable or disadvantaged before, during, and after emergencies, as well as in their needs for mitigation, transition, and adaptation to climate change. Welcome, Aaron and Bridget, and over to you for the presentation.
Thank you so much, Tristan, and thank you to everybody for coming along. It's really great to be here today. I've attended a number of these webinars, and it's always just such a fantastic opportunity to hear more about the work that's going on around the world. And, you know, Tristan provides a really fantastic opportunity for us to come together and learn from one another. And I'm really grateful for the ongoing opportunity and for this opportunity in particular. So as Tristan said, my name is Bridget. I work with Australian Red Cross. On to the next slide, please, Aaron. Before we commence, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which Aaron and myself, and certainly Tristan, meet here in Australia. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. So look, Australian Red Cross works in emergencies and disasters, much like all of the Red Cross societies around the world. And our work in emergencies and disasters is based on an evidence-based theory of change. Now, this theory of change includes 4 key capacities that we've identified as crucial to communities preparing for, coping with, and recovering from these life-changing events. And the 4 capacities are knowledge, connection, social capital, security, and well-being. And for almost 20 years, social capital or connection has been a really critical component of the work that we do with communities before, during, and after emergencies or disasters. And I'm just going to touch on a couple of those really quickly. So with our resilience work, we know that when communities are connected, or when they have high levels of social capital, that they're able to help each other in an emergency and, if needed, during the recovery journey as well after an event. So as part of our resilience work, we work with individuals, households, communities, and emergency services, government and organisations to really enable people to participate, to connect with others, to lead and take action before, during, and after disasters. And this connection is a really key and crucial component of that resilience building. It's about knowing your neighbours. It's about being part and feeling a part of your community and neighbourhood. It's being about being connected to decision makers and others that can help in these situations. Similarly, in our response work, our response program is based on the 5 pillars of psychosocial support. That is safety, calm, self-efficacy, social connection, and hope. And these five pillars really form the foundation of psychological first aid, which is a globally recognised approach for supporting individuals in the immediate aftermath of traumatic events. And again, I'd highlight that that social connection is one of those key pillars of that psychosocial support. And finally, we really know that social capital plays a particularly important role in individual and community recovery. So that trust, that interconnectedness, those social and economic networks are the things that people can draw upon to support their own individual functioning and their community functioning during that prolonged period following disasters. And as part of our recovery work, when we deliver recovery programs to people and communities that have been affected by disaster, we really try to build on that connection within communities. Next slide, please, Aaron. So look, a number of years ago, we did some work through a collaboration called the Australian Business Roundtable to estimate the economic cost of the social impact of disasters. So you'd all be well aware that when we talk about the impact of disasters and the financial cost of that, we're often looking at things like the number of homes destroyed, roads or bridges damaged, and that physical infrastructure cost. One of the things that we don't necessarily do particularly well here in Australia is to try and quantify the cost of the social impact. So what is the cost of increases in family violence, increases in drug and alcohol abuse? What is the social cost of displacement? So the work that we did with the Australian Business Roundtable found that the economic cost was at least equal to the physical costs of recovery. This work also found that further research was required into the ways that we can quantify the medium and long-term costs of the social impact of natural disasters. And to date, that sort of evidence that demonstrates the economic benefit of investing in social capital was largely anecdotal and primarily qualitative. There was really an absence of empirical evidence, which made it really difficult for government and other funding bodies to then quantify and justify spending on initiatives that build social capital for resilience purposes. So to help address this, last year Australian Red Cross commissioned Deakin University to undertake research into the role and monetary value of social capital in disasters. And the report was released late last year. I'd like to now pass over to Dr. Aaron Nicholas from Deakin University, who was one of the primary researchers on this research to go through the findings of the report. Over to you, Aaron.
Thank you, Bridget. Okay, so to follow up from where Bridget stopped, so this study will be looking at specifically a nationally representative for Australia and what we term econometrically rigorous attempt at looking at the way in which social capital might mitigate any negative effects from natural disasters, but we're going to focus particularly on bushfires here. And the evidence base is wide, but in various forms, in various different contexts. And I'm not going to go through the literature review here. For those interested, I'm happy to send the report. Just drop me an email. But what we're going to be looking at is really a very big snapshot of at the national level, a bird's eye view, but using well-recognized methods in economics and econometrics. And also, I was told that the format was to leave questions to the end, but at any point, if anything's unclear at least, please do let me know so that I can correct it immediately rather than wait till the end. Now, there are many ways, I guess, to define social capital, but one of the more common ways, and in fact, I noticed this on the website as well, this is the definition used, is the bonding, bridging, and linking social capital definitions, where bonding is about within group links. So your social groups that you already recognize as people you'd interact with typically, whether it's a family, your friends, colleagues, so on and so forth. And your closeness or ability to use those links is some form of bonding social capital, where bridging social capital moves across such groups or beyond such groups, those who are outside your typical realm of interactions. And linking social capital, which is some sort of movement across hierarchies, particularly links to people who are in charge or in power or who make decisions at a large level. For this study, we will be looking primarily at bonding and bridging social capital, but we won't be able to say too much about differences between them, and it will be clear when I tell you or show you the measure that we're going to use. Okay, so as I said, our main focus is really to look at this at a large scale national-wide level. And so how do we go about doing this? We are going to use the Household Income and Labor Dynamics in Australia survey, also known as the HILDA. What this does is it tracks about 17,000 households, the same households, although sometimes they leave the sample and they have to be replaced. And these households are surveyed from 2001 to 2019, at least for our purposes. That's what we're going to be using. And what's interesting here is we are able to link this data with administrative state level data on exposure to bushfires. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a statistical area definition called an SA2. And Australia is broken up according to this classification from this figure, as you can see in this figure over here, by an SA2 definition, right? What you'll notice here is that the size of the areas are not uniformly distributed. So some areas are really big. That's because areas that are big tend to have more sparse populations. And so it's kind of trying to control for similar sized populations, although that's not exactly true either. But that's one way to think about why we have much larger divisions on, for example, the West Coast. And here we have the color coding according to SA2. The share or percentage of SA2 area burnt as an average across the year 2001 and 2019. So, for example, the very dark red areas have at least 12% of their mass or area burnt in a given year on average over those 20 years, if it's dark red, right? And so just looking at this, it looks like the west side of Australia, for example, tends to experience much more surface or area burnt, although again, it's hard to say because the SA2 definitions are really large on the west coast, right? Simply because most of the population is on the east coast. Okay, so that's this percentage share of SA2 burnt is going to be our primary disaster variable, right? So the bushfire variable, this is what we're going to use, and variation of this is what we're going to track in order to kind of identify the effect of bushfires on outcomes that we are interested in. How we go about it, so why I'm going into detail because one of my co-authors did all the work on this and it's great work and he wants to show how amazing it is. So the kind of data we used, right? So we get the administrative data on what an SA2 area is. So for example, this gray line tells you the SA2 area for an area called Alexandra. And the red area shows you the state level data we have on the size of the bushfire. Right? And so once we interlay these two pieces of data on each other, we can therefore identify that for this area, Alexandra, this black bordered line is the amount of the size of the bushfire that affected specifically only Alexandra. And that's how we calculate the percentage of Alexandra that was burnt in a given year. Okay. And so we do this for the whole country except the areas that are white. And I think this is the largest white area where we have no, unfortunately, administrative data on, and therefore we have to exclude from the study. Okay, so that's our measure in terms of the disaster, which is the bushfire. And here we're going to look at the measure of social capital. For this, we use the HILDA survey, which is a survey on households. But what happens is the head or representative member of the household will answer this question, which is to what extent do you agree with these 5 questions about your neighborhood, right? And it's just a scale from 1 to 7, so some sort of Likert. And you have questions about your closeness of your neighborhood, whether people are going to help their neighbors, people in the neighborhood can be trusted, people in the neighborhood generally do not get along with each other, so this will be reverse coded for our purposes. People in this neighborhood generally do not share the same values. Again, this would be reverse coded because it goes in the opposite direction. And what we do is we take an average of this to form an index of sorts, right? So the social capital index is just the average of this. And in addition to that, what we do is we basically want to assign one number of social capital to each of these SA2 regions. So we take the average of all households within an SA2, take their responses to that question and average it, and then we assign one number to each SA2 in terms of their social capital, right? So that's what effectively will be our main source of variation for social capital. As you notice from the questions, this is only going to be able to capture bonding and bridging type social capital because it's really about the neighborhood. And we won't be able to differentiate bonding and bridging because within a neighborhood, we don't know how, I guess, whether you'd consider those relationships as bonding to start with, and we don't have data on that. And so it's going to be some combination of those. Also, what we're going to do ultimately is instead of taking the actual score, because this varies from 1 to 7, what we're going to do is we're going to divide each SA2 or all the SA2s into three groups and evenly separated, so terciles, right? We're going to have low social capital, moderate social capital, and high social capital, right? So an equal number of SA2s in each of these groups. Now, why do we do this? It's because the effect of social capital in terms of mitigating the negative impacts of disasters may not be linear as we increase social capital, right? So as we increase social capital, you may find an effect at the low levels, but you may not find effects on high levels. Or it could be the other way around. As you increase social capital, it could be the case that social capital only starts having a strong mitigatory effect at very high levels. And so what we want to do with this classification is it allows us to compare the impact of social capital at a low level versus a high level. Okay, and so as a starting point, we just did 3 groups. Of course, you could do any number of different groups. But the group comparison allows us to make non-linear hypothesis with regards to the relationship. Okay, now this is the SA2 mapping according to this social capital measure. Okay, now the darker red indicates the high level of social capital. The pinkish is moderate or medium levels, and the lightest color is the low level of social capital. Remember, this is a tercile, so there's an actually equal number of SA2s assigned to each group. The gray areas, unfortunately, we don't have any data on, and you'll notice that we actually have less data on this than we did on the bushfires, right? Why? It's because this one comes from survey data, whereas the bushfire data is administrative data, and so we have more information on that. But unfortunately, we will be reduced to this, the lowest denominator, simply because we have to combine all the data. Okay. Finally, we come to our third variable, which is the outcome indicator. So just a quick recap of what we're actually interested in doing here. We are interested in knowing whether having more social capital reduces the negative impact of a natural disaster, namely bushfires. However, the impact or negative impacts of bushfires, we're going to measure using 3 different outcomes, okay? Life satisfaction, mental health, and income. So life satisfaction and mental health will both be our, I guess, intangible or non-economic measures, right? So this allows us to capture the kind of things that Bridget was talking about just now, which is impacts beyond physical, beyond monetary. In fact, we won't be able to capture any of this physical building damage with any of these variables because even the income one is an income. It's not damage to your assets or so on and so forth, right? Life satisfaction is self-reported measure across 8 items. We just use whatever we could from the HILDA survey. The mental health measure is an SF36, which is a 36-item survey in the HILDA as well. And income will just be gross total annual income. Okay, so what exactly will we do? So I'm not going to show any equations. And I won't go into the technical details. So some of this will be not exactly what we do, but hopefully I'm going to be able to show enough of a flavor of what we're doing here. So remember, I said we separated the SA2s into three groups, those with low social capital, those with moderate levels, and those with high levels. Now, forgive me for changing the color code. Here, the red is for the low and the green is for the high. I thought it might be more appropriate given red is typically bad. Okay, now what we do is we're going to compare regions without disasters with regions with disasters. Okay, so that's one way to think about it. It's not exactly what we do because the variable is actually continuous. It changes over a very continuous scale. But the simplest way to think about it is if you could split it into two groups, then we're going to compare those without with those with and within the same level of social capital. Okay, and let's exclude the high social capital for now, just for simplicity's sake. What we actually are interested in is knowing, let's say this red arrow tells us the impact of moving from a community with low social capital without disasters to one with. Okay, so that's the impact for low. We also have the equivalent impact for the moderate social capital community. And what we're interested is the difference between the red and the yellow. Okay, so we call this a difference in difference because as we move from here to here, we get one difference. We move from here to here, we get another difference. And it's the difference in these two differences that we're actually interested in. Now, why is this? Because this allows us to say whether the impact changes with social capital, right? So the impact of the disaster, right, whether that changes as we move from low to moderate, okay, or the gap between these two, how does that gap change as we change the level of social capital? Okay, now this is where I guess I should take questions if there are on what we're going to do so far, because I'm going to then jump into the results after this. So I'm happy to jump in. There's no clarification questions on what exactly is being done here. Nope. All right, good. So on average, and this is what unfortunately because we were going to effectively use regressions, it's going to give us average relationships. And we're looking at a very large the national level, and therefore on average, bushfires actually had no statistically significant effect on either life satisfaction, mental health, or annual income. Okay, now this may come as kind of a shock or a crazy finding, because we know that there are large impacts of bushfires on these outcomes. But what happens here is because we're looking at the national level, right, and we're taking into account every single bushfire, right, that you can actually keep track of in Australia. What happens is most bushfires occur in areas where there are no people living in. Right, and so bushfires, not surprisingly, will not have impacts, even though they may burn a large area. If there's no one in the area, then there's no scope for affecting either of these variables. And so on average, therefore, because that's going to wipe out any strong effects that we do detect. Okay, and so in that sense, we don't want to harp on this non-effect, overall effect, right? So that's not, I guess, that interesting once because we're looking at such a high or large level. Now, we do, however, detect negative effects of the bushfires on certain population subgroups. Okay, and so that's what I'm going to focus on. All right, so remember I had the low, the moderate, and the high level of social capital based on that questionnaire response and that index that we constructed for them. Now, the first subgroup that we found effects or that I want to focus on is the subgroup that actually has the largest negative impact, well, the largest mitigatory impact also from social capital, and it's those living in remote regions in Australia. Okay, so you have those living in urban areas, then you have people living in regional areas, and remote areas are basically the most sparsely populated. And it's there that we actually find our strongest effects. And the first effect I want to focus on is the effect on the annual income. Okay, so instead of those three outcome variables, which is life satisfaction, mental health, and annual income, I want to focus on annual income first because it's the easiest to interpret. Now, if you have low social capital in a remote region, what we find is that this reduces, on average, an individual's annual income by $2,304. Okay. Now, we don't exactly know why. It could be unemployment. It could be you switch to a lower job. It could be that you take permanent leave for the period that's relevant. We don't know, but that's the direct impact on income itself. If, however, you have a moderate level of social capital or you're in a community, so let me be more specific. If you're living in a community with a moderate level of social capital in a remote region, then the actual negative impact of the bushfire on the annual income is actually only $101 now. It's still negative, but it's only 101 now, right? And the impact when you're on a high level of social capital is the same. Why? Because we couldn't detect any statistical difference between moderate or high levels of social capital. So remember, I mentioned that the impact of social capital might not be linear, and that's why we split it up into groups. And this is exactly where it's showing up. It says that when you move from low to moderate, you are mitigating quite a large impact, right? You are reducing the negative impact from 2,304 to 101. However, when you move to moderate to high, the impact is insignificant. Okay, and so that's a non-linear impact. It suggests this is where we need to target the movement from low to moderate. Now, I'll get to the policy prescriptions right at the end of the talk, so so I don't get too distracted. But at least in terms of how to interpret what's going on here, we're going to drop the high simply because there's no statistical difference between moderate and high. Okay, so for going forward, I'm not going to talk about comparisons with moving to high anymore. So here, remember I said I was doing the difference in a difference, and so the difference between these two is exactly what we call the mitigatory effect, and that's $22,003, right? The difference between these two estimates. All right, so moving social capital from low to moderate levels effectively reduces the loss in annual income by $2,203. Okay, now remember we have three outcome variables. We have annual income, we have life satisfaction, and we have mental health. Now, mental health and life satisfaction are much more difficult to talk about. Okay, now why? First off, the responses we have on this are based on self-reports, and not only are they based on self-reports, they are based on some sort of Likert scale, right? How satisfied are you with your life? How satisfied are you with this aspect of your life? Very satisfied, not so satisfied. How do we compare this with, say, annual income, right? Or even between life satisfaction and mental health? It's not exactly comparable to start with. In addition, even if you could somehow say that this is stronger than annual income, because if it's not translatable, I guess, to some sort of monetary amount, it may be difficult potentially to use in cost-benefit analysis. Not that that's the only way to do things, but what I'm trying to highlight here is that there may be advantages to try to convert the life satisfaction and mental health impacts into some monetary measure, simply so we can, first of all, compare it to the annual income estimate. And then on top of that, perhaps use it in some sort of cost-benefit policy making in trying to decide whether it's worth investing in pushing capital, social capital, for example, here in this context, from the low to moderate level or the lowest tercile to the middle tercile, right? So, for example, an example of that would be, we know we have this number, right? This one is perhaps more easy to interpret. One way to use this as a cost benefit number is to say, look, let's say the government could push societies from a low to moderate level of income at the cost of $1,000 per person. Should they do it? Well, we know that if they move from a low to moderate, right, on average, the mitigation is going to be 2,203 in terms of income that's protected, right? And so paying $1,000 to move people from low to moderate is worth it, and from that simple perspective, because the gains is simply larger, right? So that's a very overly simplified way of using these numbers, but the point is this allows us to use it in that way if we want to. And so can we do the equivalence for life satisfaction and mental health? And so this is our attempt at doing so. There are obviously limitations and lots of caveats attached to this, but this is our attempt. And so what do? the result we get from our actual survey on life satisfaction is that there is a significant mitigatory effect when we move from low to moderate. And that effect is 0.0 units of life satisfaction based on the index constructed from this life satisfaction measure. Now, how do we use this, right? And so we have to ask, okay, what is this 0.08 life satisfaction units worth, right? When we move communities from a low level of social capital to a moderate level of social capital. And the way we're going to convert this or measure its worth is to use what's known as a compensating valuation framework, where basically the question is, how much money, and when we say money, it's going to be money dropped from the sky onto your lap, so it's a windfall income, must a person receive to negate the loss of 0.08 units of life satisfaction that would have occurred if they didn't have the moderate or higher level of social capital, right? So basically, the result shows that if you move from a low to moderate level of social capital, you're going to save or you're going to gain 0.08 life satisfaction units. Our question is, how much income, equivalent in income, must I give you to generate that 0.08 life satisfaction units, right? Once I have the answer to that question, I can therefore say that the life satisfaction gains from having a higher level of social capital is equivalent to this amount of money, right? As if I had given you this amount of money instead, right? And so the answer to this question is $3,808. So this we could estimate from the Hilda survey, right? So the Hilda survey has data on windfall in earnings, and it has data on life satisfaction. And so we could causally estimate how this windfall earnings affect life satisfaction. And so it takes $3,808 to increase life satisfaction by 0.08 units. And therefore, this 0.08 units mitigated by having a higher level of social capital can be said to be equivalent to $3,808. Okay, so that's the rabbit that we pull out of the magician's hat, right, to make this conversion. Okay, so we have life satisfaction. It's 3,808. Remember, the annual income estimate is 2,203. The equivalent for mental health is 5,940. So now, how do we compare this tree, right? How do we interpret the fact that they're quite different and it is largest for mental health? Okay, so first, let's look at life satisfaction. In some sense, I guess it's not surprising that the number is larger than annual income. In some sense, we want it to be, because the whole point of taking life satisfaction is to argue that there's going to be all kinds of effects or negative effects from from a disaster that's not going to be captured by annual income. Okay, and so life satisfaction effectively absorbs all of this. So the annual income effects or negative effects from a disaster is going to be captured by life satisfaction. It absorbs that, but it absorbs all kinds of other things in addition to that, right? And so in that sense, it makes sense that it's going to be higher. Okay, now why is it that mental health is even higher than life satisfaction? Okay, so this one is a bit trickier. So remember, to get the measurement that we got, we had to ask, how much income do I have to give to you? Or how much windfall income do I have to give to you to generate the same amount of life satisfaction that was mitigated through a higher level of social capital? It's the same thing for mental health. How much income do I have to give you to generate the same amount of mental health that was mitigated by an increase in social capital? Now, it turns out that giving people income doesn't really increase mental health by that much. And that's why we get a large number here, right? So the point is, because income doesn't tend to increase mental health by much, then we have to give quite a lot of income in order to mitigate mental health losses, right? So this large number tells us quite interestingly enough in some way, that's one way of interpreting it, is if you are actually interested in mitigating mental health losses from a disaster, it may be much more efficient to do it through increasing social capital than expose doing it by transferring income, right? Because income doesn't have strong effects on mental health, at least within the sample that we're looking at here, right? And that's why mental health has a higher value than life satisfaction. So I guess this raises some interesting questions on what policymakers should target, right? After a disaster, what do you want to, I guess, um, mitigate? What do you want to bring people back to prior to the disaster? Is it income that you're worried about? Is it economic features? Is it their life satisfaction? Is it their mental health? Right? Because this question gives us very different approaches and very different estimates as to how much it's worth investing in something like social capital. Okay. Another way to think about the estimates that we got. So remember, our estimates on life satisfaction and mental health is not exactly the same as the annual income because we had to do the magic trick of converting them into monetary numbers. One way to interpret them, it's equivalent to giving this $3,808 of unexpected compensatory cash after a disaster, right? So if you think of two policies, one where should I increase social capital from low to moderate levels in this community, or should I, after a disaster, simply provide a cash transfer, right? Then this tells us it's as if this movement from low to moderate is equivalent to a policy that transfers $3,808 after a disaster, right? And that allows you to do that so-called equivalent cost benefit analysis. Okay, that was quite a mouthful. Any questions? All right, so just to inflate the numbers a bit, a back of the envelope calculation that we can do. So the average size of the population in a remote community. So remember, all these results that we have is for remote regions, right? And so in our population, which is the whole of Australia, the average size of a remote community is 6,770. Right? And therefore, if you use the most conservative estimate we have, which is this, which is on the loss on annual income, and so moving communities from a low to moderate level of social capital for the average size population in Australia is going to mitigate an annual income loss of around $15 million, right? Again, this is an average, so you can't apply it to every single community. It's just what happens if you did apply it to all of them. On average, this is what would happen, right? Now, if you move to a life satisfaction equivalent, it then goes up to 25 million simply because life satisfaction is 3,808 per individual. Okay, so this is back of the envelope. Please don't quote me on this. It's just to show that look, if it's potentially quite large, right? Okay, now did we find other effects? We also found effects on individuals age above 66. Social capital did have a mitigatory effect on life satisfaction. It didn't affect income. It didn't affect mental health for this group, actually, only life satisfaction. And it also had an impact on those who are marginally attached to the labor force. Again, only life satisfaction. So it's interesting. Life satisfaction really is picking up a lot of things that mental health and income cannot pick up, right? Sorry, what's marginally attached to the labor force? It's people who are not looking for work, so therefore you can't be unemployed because you're not looking for work, but you would work if you were offered a job, right? So it's kind of this really strange in between place, right? And there we do find some effect. But these numbers are much lower than the equivalent we saw for those in the remote region. So this is 396 for the age above 66, and this is 276 for those marginally attached to the labor force. Okay. So that's basically it for our, I guess, main results, or at least results that we're confident enough to present. Now, I guess one way to think about one thing I've been harping about at least is using these numbers for cost benefit analysis, right? However, we can't actually do cost benefit analysis because what we have is really just the benefits, right? These numbers are basically the benefits of moving societies from a low level of social capital to moderate levels. Now, what we don't have is actually the cost, which is how much does it cost to move a community from a low tercile to a middle tercile of social capital, right? And this question is very difficult, obviously, because it's going to vary considerably by the context. And so, but basically to use this as in a cost benefit framework, that needs to be answered, right? However, one thing useful in this project, the result is because, for example, vulnerable groups like those in remote regions are the groups that should be targeted. It may make sense to ask how much does it cost to raise the social capital levels, particularly those who are in remote regions with low social levels of social capital, right? At least that targeted information search would make sense. Okay, so summary of what we have. So we do find strong mitigatory effects of social capital for those living in remote areas. We also find some weaker effects for those aged 66 and above 66, sorry, and those marginally attached to the workforce. And so in some sense, it makes sense, of course, to think this as somewhat vulnerable and exposed groups, particularly in terms of social capital, actually. Or we may think of it the other way, which is these are groups for which we would expect to be much more reliant on social capital as well, right? Of course, this is ex post rationalization. You can imagine a lot of other groups that would be reliant as well, which we don't find effects for. But at least this group that we do find effects for, they're consistent with the story that social capital, it makes sense that social capital would somehow have an impact on them. Okay, so the study has been, of course, like I said, differentiating from existing studies by looking at a large-scale national level view, but this comes at a cost. We cannot discriminate, for example, between bonding or bridging social capital, and we don't even capture much to do with linking social capital, although maybe some of this effect is there, but we have no idea. And we effectively can't identify mechanisms because we expect a plethora of mechanisms to be working here to start with, right? Social capital by construct is not going to be homogeneous, and therefore, policy-wise, it can't give us a very simple mechanism to focus on. And of course, these are average effects, and so there could be heaps of heterogeneity even within remote regions, right? This just says that, look, if you're going to start from the national level, that's where you want to, your first step of where you're going to focus is here, but even then, there's much more focusing that needs to be done after. And that's it. So, Bridget, do you want to, oh no, that's, sorry. Did you want to say anything on this or?
I'll just quickly thank you so much for presenting that, Aaron. I think the findings of this research for Red Cross really underscore the necessity of prioritising investment in social capital. And we really see this investment as having a double dividend. Communities with strong social capital can thrive on a day-to-day basis, and they're better equipped to withstand sort of everyday shocks and challenges. And in terms of this research, this is made, very prominent in the case of life satisfaction, mental health and wellbeing, and income. But for Red Cross and I guess other people working in the disaster resilience space, it also means that communities affected by disaster that have had that investment in social capital can recover faster, have improved mental health, and greater economic stability after disasters. So I think we really see this piece of research as adding to the global body of knowledge. I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done. We're starting to think about social capital and its relation to social cohesion and what that might look like, what some of the frameworks and measurements and underlying data that we can utilise to really understand what that means, particularly from a disaster resilience perspective. But as I said, social capital, I think, does offer a double dividend. It really supports communities to function well on a day-to-day basis, and it ensures that they're better placed to cope with the impacts of disaster. So that's the end of our sort of formal presentation, I guess. And I'm available for any questions from a Red Cross perspective. And of course, Aaron can answer any questions from a research perspective. So I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aaron and Bridget. Fascinating presentation, and really great to see the way you've really brought this to life and put some numbers on it, which I think is so often the challenge with this kind of work is it's hard to communicate just exactly what the kind of impact is and just how important it is. So it's great to see some numbers. So we'll have some questions and discussion now. You can either raise your hand, which you'll find within Zoom under the React button. When I call upon you to ask your question, you can unmute yourself to do so. Alternatively, you can post in the chat, and if you're not in a position to speak yourself, just let me know in the chat and I'll be happy to read out the question on your behalf. So feel free to get your questions in now, but perhaps I'll start with the first one. It seems like this is obvious stuff, and we just need numbers to be able to communicate to people just how important it is. And the first instinct I had was that you could almost add the three numbers together, but there's clearly some overlap between them, so it's not quite as simple as that. But then we could also just go through a very long list of other things that we could potentially try to value as well that are impacts and outcomes of social capital in a community. And it can be quite significant. And when you add all those together, of course, then you get an even bigger number again. But I guess that process is very difficult to do. But what do you think about trying to identify where the overlap is and how we might go about trying to get one number rather than three different numbers?
So very good question. In terms of overlap, there's actually two sources of potential overlap. I'll talk about the, in some sense, easier one. So for example, even the subgroups overlap. So you can imagine, for example, if you're age over to 66 and you're marginally attached to the labor force and you're living in a remote area, then we simply, in some sense, add up all these numbers, right? But that's not true because our study does not allow us to account for that. But you could. And so now that we found this, for example, these three characteristics are particularly important, you could estimate a special model that tries to estimate all of it jointly at the same time. That would give you that one number for a group with all three characteristics, for example. But here we can't, so they're not additive. Now, for the other one, which is this number here, this one we can't add up at all in some sense because, for example, life satisfaction would include a loss in income, right? So your life satisfaction goes down partly because your income has gone down. And your life satisfaction goes down partly because mental health has gone down. So in some sense, life satisfaction, we would imagine is the most absorbing state, but we don't know. It could be that mental health is the highest state. I mean, it's definitely the case that the economic factor is the lower level one, and the non-tangibles are the higher. But there's a ranking and there's an overlap, and therefore it's an interesting question because that's why I highlighted in some sense that policymakers have to ask which variable they actually want to target. They're not the same things, right? And they're definitely not additive either, right? So it's an interesting, in some sense, philosophical question. But I mean that has actually very huge impacts because how you answer this question determines whether it's worth investing 2002 versus close to 6,000, three times the amount in social capital, for example.
Right. And it really does seem like they're overlapping, that mental health includes life satisfaction to some extent, but there's more to it than that. And vice versa, life satisfaction includes mental health, but there's more to it than that as well. So they're
Exactly.
overlapping in that kind of way. But the fact that the mental health number is bigger seems to indicate that it is more important as long as you assume that mental health is also more important.
Exactly. Exactly.
So it's an interesting kind of, we've got a number, but we still have to find that particular factor to be worthy of spending that money on to have its importance in its own right.
I guess the typical stance is people don't even think that these things are affected, and therefore they don't even ask this difficult question. But these numbers, I guess, kind of points out that unfortunately we have to answer this question, this difficult question, because it has a huge impact on how we do policy.
Yeah,
But
for
yeah, there are
sure.
no easy answers.
No. So feel free to get your questions in. If you have any questions, feel free to either raise your hand or post in the chat. Elizabeth, feel free to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. I have a question for each of the presenters. Bridget, I'll start with you. What has the feedback been to the report? How has the reception been on it?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Thank you, Elizabeth. And great that you are up in the middle of the night, and I hope you're well and not too sleepy. We've had a fantastic response to this report, as evidenced by the fact that we're presenting it here today, almost a year after it was released. It certainly generated a lot of interest within the emergency management and disaster resilience sector here in Australia. And there is this sort of slowly growing body of knowledge and understanding around social capital and I guess around you know, the sociology, if you like, of disasters more broadly, and really moving beyond that sort of that quantification of disasters from either an insurance perspective or a rebuilding perspective, and really a much more nuanced understanding about the impact of disasters on community functioning, on individual well-being, and so forth. And so, you know, we're really we've seen a lot of engagement and uptake of this report and of the findings of the report. I think you know, there were some limitations to the report, which Aaron has touched on, and I think it was a fairly short and sharp deep dive, if you like, that's presented us with a lot of answers, but has probably also opened up a lot more questions. And what we'd really love to do is to somehow find some funding to really extend this research and do a much, much longer and deeper research project into this. But thank you. We've had terrific engagement.
Well, that is wonderful to hear. I was hoping that it would be that case, but you never know. So kudos to that. And then for Aaron, I also wanted to give a shout out because you did a fantastic job presenting a really complex study and all these variables, walking through the difference in difference methodology. So shout out to you for that. You my understanding is that you've measured kind of the benefits at the individual level. So for every individual times these different amounts, 2203, adding up to the 15 million. Is there any way to capture any kind of aggregate benefit? So for example, at the community level, if they needed less you know, assistance from the fire department or the Red Cross, you know, having kind of a multi-level value proposition, not just the individual level.
Yes, that's such a great question. We haven't thought about whether the numbers we get actually are restricted to the individual or whether they would absorb some of this community level, infrastructural level type stuff. Yeah, that's a great question actually. So what happens is our measures are typically restricted to the SA2 level. So it may actually absorb some of this, but no, it's something to think about. It's a great question. Thank you.
Certainly is a great question. And I think you're onto something with that too, Elizabeth, because I think there probably are some community level impacts that we could have a look at and take into account. And there's bound to be other things too. Like we looked at 3 different things: annual income, life satisfaction, mental health, but you could probably list off another 20 or 30 or 100 different things that also potentially are impacted by disasters and related to social capital. And so this, I think, is just a really good exemplar of 3 of those things. And like the hope, I guess, is that people take notice of it and say, yes, we should be investing in social capital because there's a very tangible return on that investment. There's a very tangible reason to make that investment.
And our inability, if it's true that our estimates don't capture the things just mentioned, then we're actually underestimating it, right? So this is a conservative estimate of the potential benefits.
Yeah, correct. So feel free to get your questions in. We do have a little bit of time if you have any questions that you'd like to explore. I mean, I guess from my side, I'm really interested in what the next step is. I know that funding is always a challenge. We need to get funding in order to do more work. But if you had a nice big bucket of money, what would be on the top of your wish list?
Aaron, you go first from a researcher perspective, and then I'll sort of come in as a user, if you like.
Well, not in terms of research that I can do, but I would like to know how much it costs to actually increase social capital. I mean, I would actually want to know that, but I don't have the capacity to do that kind of research actually. Personally, for our the kind of research that we can and the kind of data we potentially can get, it's exactly the kind of stuff mentioned already. We need to dig deeper into mechanisms, right? What exactly is going on? What are the channels? And is it going to be the case that social capital works when you have some sort of critical mass? Certain kinds of communities or so on and so forth, definitely.
And of course, the challenge with that question of how much does it cost to increase social capital, it's going to be for initiative X, it costs this much. And for initiative Y, it costs a different amount potentially. And the effectiveness of X and Y might be quite different. And that's part of the work that we need to do is explore like what are the mechanisms to increase social capital and which ones end up having the most impact for the least amount of overall cost.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right, Tristan. And I think, you know, the unique cohorts that this research identified as being particularly at risk. So people over the age of 66, people marginally attached to the workforce, people who are divorced or separated, and so on. You know, it'd be really interesting to be able to dig deeper into those cohorts to understand why that was. And some of the limitations of the research were that we weren't able to, or didn't have the capacity to look at some key groups here in Australia, including First Nations communities, multicultural communities, people with disabilities, and so forth. So I think there's a lot more sort of nuance to be undertaken. But I think one of the high level things that I took away was there are some key groups that we need to be really mindful of when it comes to building resilience and using social capital as a kind of mechanism for building resilience. And they are these groups that were highlighted in Aaron's presentation.
Yeah. Is there a difference between, do you think, the type of disaster as well? Just thinking the difference between fire and flood, for example.
So we actually did look at storms as well, but we didn't find any effects. Now, partly because storm data is also weaker, there's less, I guess, I can't remember, but I'm not sure it's because we don't have enough data or whether the type of data we have doesn't give us enough variation to detect effects. And so we actually didn't find too much effects there, and we dropped the analysis on storms.
Right.
Yeah, and I think flood data in Australia is not consistent, whereas the bushfire data was much more consistent across the states and territories. So we're able to bring it all together and compare like with like. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great question, Tristan. And you know, certainly, you know, we've had very significant floods in the past few years here in Australia, and what we're seeing as Red Cross in terms of the impacts on communities is quite different to what we see following bushfires.
Yeah, and I guess the pattern in which people are affected by these types of disasters probably matters, because if some people are very severely and negatively affected, whereas other people are virtually unaffected at all, then that's going to perhaps hide some of the significance of the effects within the data as well.
Exactly. And it could very well be the case that we're picking up what we're picking up exactly because it's exactly the vulnerable groups who are responsive to social capital.
Yeah, perhaps. So, Bridget, I don't know if you got to talk about what you wish you could do if you had a big pot of money.
Oh, well, if I had a big pot of money, I think I'd ask Deakin to continue this kind of line of research and dig a lot deeper. I think what we really need as an organisation, and I think a lot of community sector organisations are needing, is that really clear economic case that we can put forward to governments, to philanthropy, and to others to say, by investing, you know, $1 million in this particular social capital initiative, this will be the outcome and the impact. And to have those very clear numbers against it, you know, that is what we really need.
Yeah, and it's really on the building side is perhaps where those numbers need to be generated to demonstrate that return on investment, because we already have some numbers on the other side, and when you add on all of the other kind of flow-on effects and benefits that come not just to disaster resilience, preparedness, and recovery, but in all the other areas in which social capital has an impact, that number doesn't seem to need to be stronger from what I can understand, but we do need to understand how much it costs to improve and to build social capital, and perhaps that's where the most of the work needs to be done.
Yeah, I think you're right, Tristan. And I think there's also a situation of sectors not actually talking to one another and sharing things with one another. So where you might have a sector over here that's got a great case and has made all the economic arguments and so forth, but the emergency management disaster resilience sector isn't actually talking to them and isn't aware. So we're all missing out, you know, in our silos.
Yeah, precisely. So we'll get to Elizabeth's question in the chat in just a minute, but Jean, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question or comment?
Oh, yeah, right. Yes, can you hear from me? Can you hear from me
Yes.
now?
Yes.
All right. So thank you very much for your presentation for both presenters. I'm coming from the Seychelles, and I think this study has direct implication for a small island state like the Seychelles, which is very vulnerable in terms of the environment, all the different impact, climate change, the sea level rise and all. I think I've learned quite a lot, which obviously I can sort of make use of the findings for the improvement of the work that I'm doing here in the agricultural sector within the Seychelles. But I was wondering, it is interesting, by the way, to see that you've been able to sort of put some numbers, obviously, to social capital and different effect. But when it comes to the transformation from social capital to economic capital, how do you think your studies would sort of give some kind of recommendation with regards to the transformation of social capital to economic capital? Because I'm beginning to see that your studies is leading towards this dimension. Thank you.
I guess it depends how we define economic capital. So I guess if you're thinking of longer term resilience on the economic side of things, then it's a good question, because what we're looking at here is very short term, the immediate effects of a disaster, right? And in fact, there could be long term effects that we're not looking at. And again, we are underestimating what you have here. So for example, we say that the income loss per year is this, right? But this is the immediately in the year of the bushfire itself. Now, it could very well be the case that your income is affected for many, many years after, right? In which case, I guess when I feel free to clarify, but I guess some sort of economic capital will be resilience to long-term impacts, right, on economic variables such as income, in which case we don't know. But that's exactly a great follow-up on what are the long-term impacts, and to what extent are we underestimating them by just looking at immediate impacts. Sorry if I didn't answer your question on economic capital specifically.
No, thank you, because I was thinking that there might be a lot of assets, there might be a lot of untapped resources, especially in the context of small island state. So you can see that now, by adding the numbers to social capital, but at the same time, you can also add more values to the different assets available, which are largely untapped from the small island perspective, especially from the tourism perspective, from the environmental, the marine oceanic perspective. So I can see that these studies can also lead towards this kind of analysis. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Let's go to Elizabeth next.
I'm having a few questions. You so much great inspiration here. But one question that came into my mind was the homeowners insurance. And I'm not exactly sure how it works in Australia, but in California, we're having a terrible time because of the wildfires. The insurance companies are leaving the state. And so we're having to get these very expensive safety net plans. So it seems if you're looking for a funder for this research, are there insurance companies in Australia that might be interested?
That's a fantastic suggestion, Elizabeth. And I must say, I hadn't even thought about it. I mean, and we do a lot of work with insurance companies, and we receive funding from a number of insurance companies to deliver programs across the country. It'd be certainly worth talking with them and sharing it with them so that they can understand, I guess, beyond the of insurability and uninsurability, and we are facing a similar crisis here in this country with regards to insurance. Affordability and unaffordability, accessibility and inaccessibility, but then of course also now this question of social capital. I think it's a really terrific suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. What gave me the idea, ESG, environmental social governance, has become dirty words or dirty initials here. But it's funny, the insurance companies, because of the risk associated with climate change, they're paying attention because of the risk models. So that's what planted the seed. And you've done such great work on this report. The other thing I was familiar with is this something called Phoenix Australia's Recovery Capitals. Mm-hmm. And it seems like there's a nice synergy between that and your work.
Yeah, that's another really good suggestion, Elizabeth. And Australian Red Cross was heavily involved in the development of those recovery capitals with Phoenix and a number of universities and organisations across the country. And interestingly enough, that project has received some additional funding to expand, which is absolutely fantastic. I hadn't thought of bringing the two together, but of course, as you popped in the chat and as you've spoken, I've realised, yeah, actually there might be some really interesting points of connection or synergy, as you suggest.
And then the last point that I would raise is then this notion of co-benefits, or I call it feeding two birds with one hand. And so you not only the risk mitigation and recovery costs, but also public health, and such as preventing isolation and loneliness, which is our Surgeon General just put out a big report here about the public health cost of loneliness. So framing it that way.
Yeah, that's a terrific idea. And I talked broadly about the sort of double dividend, if you like, but if you actually wanted to really narrow in and think about, well, what are those co-benefits, or what is that double dividend? And, really focusing on those particularly vulnerable groups. And yes, by investing in those, you do get broader benefits beyond just disaster resilience.
It's not just two
Thank you.
things, it's maybe 5,
Yes.
10 different things
Yeah.
that can benefit.
Yeah.
All right. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments you'd like to make? Get in quick if you do. Either raise your hand or you can post in the chat. While we're waiting to see if there are any more, I want to give 2 little plugs. First one is to our conference in Dubai in March on social capital, and there is a stream specifically dedicated to disaster emergency management. We've got some great invited speakers for that, and of course a lot of other people presenting, and it's not too late if you want to submit a proposal to come to Dubai in March. Details are posted in the chat, and you can of course have a look on our website as well for that. And the other thing I'd like to plug as well is our next webinar, which I've only literally just posted today, and I'll post a link in the chat. It's by the Search Institute. So it's on weaving webs of relationships, supporting youth success through social capital. And I think it's going to be a really great webinar next week as well. So are there any final questions? Perhaps Bridget and Aaron, perhaps you have some final things you'd like to share if you have anything in mind while we wait to see if there's any final questions.
No, but look, really just wanted to say thank you everybody for coming along. We have provided our details in the last slide, and I'm sure Tristan will share those with you. Please feel free to reach out to me or to Aaron. Really keen to connect with others working in this space across the world. We're all facing the same issues, particularly in the light of climate change. So let's all keep working together. Thanks, Tristan.
And Aaron.
Nothing else. I just thank you. It was a good opportunity, and feel free to contact us.
Okay, any final questions from anybody? Now's the time to get them in. Doesn't look like there are. So thanks everybody for taking part, and of course Bridget and Aaron for the presentation. It was very much appreciated and really enjoyable. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.